Ron Brown, the Assistant State Assessor in town. He just got done with doing some training in Ketchikan, and now he stopped here on his way back to English to do a little training for us. So, take it away.
Okay, and first, my apologies. I was sitting over there working away. I was thinking it was 5 o'clock. I was actually looking for you because I wanted to go over some points with you for this presentation, but we can address those. Anyway, first and foremost, I know being on the Board of Equalization is sometimes not exactly the most pleasant. Taxes are something none of us enjoy paying, myself included. But that is what provides us with roads, police, fire, in many cases, local community hospitals, schools is the primary beneficiary of property taxes. It is a fact of life, but it can be unpleasant at times, so we do appreciate you fulfilling this role. It is essential for the community, so first, thank you very much. Again, my name is Ron Brown. I'm the Assistant State Assessor. I've been working in assessment for 26 years. Started in 1991 in Ketchikan, Alaska. Have a fair amount of experience in Southeast. And this is one of my last roundabouts. I'm retiring in 3 months. So it's good to be back in Petersburg again. Always enjoyed Petersburg. First, everybody has a copy of the package. I'm taking it. We are going to be going through this package line item by line item. If there is something that we are discussing here that you have a question or concern about, do not hesitate to stop me. And we will discuss that point at that time. Of course, at the end, there will also be ample time to discuss any other issues you wish to go into further at that point. Do not hesitate to ask any questions. If there's something I can't answer, I will find the answer for you and get it back to you. Happy to do so. So, without further ado, points of discussion. What we're going to be talking about here is the assessment process, the role of the Board of Equalization, what is expected of the Board of Equalization. We're going to be talking about administrative hearings, how an appeal should be decided by the board, the expectations of your assessor, and what is the responsibilities of the appellant. Now, as the Board of Equalization, you are sitting here as the judge, jury, and cross-examiner. Okay, you're fulfilling multiple duties here. This is a quasi-judicial body. You are rendering decisions on an appeal of property valuation by one of your constituents. So, in this type of hearing, you are going to render a decision as a group, okay? And there is an opportunity in this process where, as the Board of Equalization, you also have the opportunity to ask questions directly of the assessor or the appellant. It's a administrative hearing, quasi-judicial setting, so it's much less formal than a true case hearing in a criminal or civil procedure. But again, it is a judicial process. And throughout this presentation here, what you're going to find out is that your decision is far from final. Your decisions can be appealed to Superior Court. Some of these decisions in the past, several times, can even end up in the state Supreme Court. They do, and they have. So, again, you have to kind of assume the role of being a judge when you're deciding a hearing. It is extremely important to presume that your decision is going to be appealed to the Superior Court. After a property owner hopefully discusses their concerns as to their value with the assessor, and if what the board is here for is when the property owner and the assessor cannot reach a mutually satisfactory agreement as to the valuation of the property, and no agreement is going to be forthcoming, that's what the board is for. The property owner and the assessor are at loggerheads. There's not going to be an agreement. The Board of Equalization will impose a value based on the evidence provided to them. That decision can be appealed by either party, by the assessor or by the appellant to Superior Court. And the decision coming out of that Superior Court can be appealed even further up the judicial process. So be aware of that. Also, too, one thing to be considered here, and we're going to deal with this in greater detail later on, is that if your decision is appealed to the Superior Court, there is not going to be a new hearing or a trial de novo. There will be no rehearing of the actual case. The Superior Court will review the record generated here, the documents provided by the appellant and by the assessor. They will review the transcripts, recordings of your session. If the Superior Court judge can, based on that record, substantiate your decision as to the decision you made and how you got there, it is highly likely the decision of the board will be sustained. If the judge cannot understand the decision that you made based on the information that is provided, they will not render a value of their own. They will remand it to you to have another hearing and do it right. Okay? So at that point, if it is remanded, then the board must reconvene. The appellant must return. The assessor must return. The entire case will then have to be reheard to at least address whatever issues the Superior Court judge felt were insufficient in the record to correct the record and render a decision that they can understand. So it's a bad decision or a decision that is accompanied by a bad record is creating substantially more work for all concerned. So make sure that you follow due process and existing law. Appeal process, the assessor is the government official responsible for establishing the value of all property within the municipal boundaries for ad valorem purposes. Ad valorem is simply Old Latin for property taxation. According to value is what ad valorem stands for. We call property taxes ad valorem taxation. It is not the duty of the Board of Equalization to establish value for ad valorem purposes, except in a BOE appeal on a particular property where the appellant has met their burden of proof. So the BOE would then listens to the appeals, the presentations of the appellant and the property owner, and if the appellant does meet their burden, that is the point where the Board of Equalization would either adopt the appellant's value or a value of their own. Statutory mandates for filing an appeal, the process for actually filing appeal, those can be found to the Board of Equalization, can be found at state statutes at AS 2945-190. That establishes the minimum standards for filing an appeal. One thing also too that should also be understood is that an appeal, when it is filed, is not an appeal to the assessor. It is an appeal to the board. The petitioner, the appellant, is appealing to the Board of Equalization, not to the assessor. Also in the statutes at 2945-210B, you can find the statutes as to the hearing. The appellant bears the burden of proof. It is presumed that the assessor has done their due diligence to establish market value in the valuation of the property. Consequently, the appellant bears the burden of proof to convince the Board of Equalization that in the case of their particular property that a mistake has been made. To be successful, an appeal must establish that the valuation on their property is unequal, excessive, improper, or undervalued. And yes, I have had in my 26 years 3 appeals where to the Board of Equalization where the property owner was actually requesting a higher value. That does happen from time to time. Rare, but it does. You certainly may.
Is an appraisal a reason to adjust the assessment value? Or does it, if somebody, an appellant walks in and says, I've got an appraisal, is that admissible in this process?
It is certainly admissible evidence, and I would tell you I've had that case many a time. Okay, the majority of the time, yes. The appraisal, I will not adopt that appraised value blank. First, I must study the appraisal. The vast majority of appraisals that I have seen are consistent, proper, and done well. Okay. I have seen other appraisals in my 26 years that were, shall we say, less than adequate. Okay. There are, and most appraisals, private appraisals are good, are sufficient. Usually what I find in those appraisals is that there is a difference between what the fee appraiser is describing or conditions of the property and what the assessor's record is reflecting. Okay. But again, I have had certain appraisals over time where I looked at them and found them lacking. Okay?
Thank you very much.
Excessive, unequal, improper, and undervalued. Those are one of those 4 criteria must be substantiated with the Board of Equalization to sustain a change for the appellant to meet their burden of proof. To be excessive, an appellant must show that the assessment is more than just overvalued. It must be shown that the assessment is grossly disproportionate when compared to other assessments. What we're talking about in this context, so far as excessive, is property values on the whole in the north side of town are at 100% of market value, and property values on the south end of town, for whatever reason, are only at 50% of market value. The values, basically in a geographic context, are unequal. There is a inequitable. Equity is a huge thing with us as assessors, is to not only be as close as we can to market value, but to be at equitable levels as close as we can. It's not a perfect science, but to be as close as we can across the spectrum. So again, if one section of town is appraised at a much higher level as measured as a percentage of the sales prices, percentage of market value, than another section of town, we refer to that as being inequitable. So in that context, that's what we're talking about with excessive. Unequal. When we're talking about unequal, let us imagine a series of, say, townhouses where we have, or tract homes that are all very, very similar, highly identical. So going down this series of townhomes, we have 200,000, 200,000, 200,000, 250,000, 200,000, 200,000, 200,000, 200,000. One of the homes, for whatever reason, is $50,000 higher than all the rest of them, and the properties are essentially carbon copies of each other. That would indeed be unequal. Now, you can't just look at the numbers. Maybe there is a particular reason why that one unit, maybe it is different inside. There might be some underlying context to that as to why that one is 50,000. But presuming that they were, in fact, identical to each other, then that 250,000, that one townhouse at 250,000 is not assessed in equity relative to the other identical properties. Improper is essentially when, in such a case where the assessor has used a wholly improper means of valuation for the property. It's tantamount to fraud, a wrong principle of valuation. Here in Alaska, what we use primarily is a technique called market-adjusted cost approach. That is a technique that is used in the fee appraisal world. It is fairly standard throughout the state of Alaska. Commercial properties, sometimes you will see where the information is available as an income approach. Or a comparable sales approach. Those are all three the primary approaches of value that are used not only in assessing but also used in the private fee appraisal world. So, undervalued. Okay, again, it does happen. Again, we're going back to the point where in the mass appraisal field, our intent is to be close to market value with all properties and to use the same technique in appraising those properties, because we are trying to achieve market value, yet at the same time we are trying to be equitable across the spectrum. So and that is one of the reasons why we use primarily the cost approach. The cost approach is highly suitable to what we call CAMA systems, which is computer-assisted mass appraisal systems. Essentially, it is a mathematical model, an algorithm, if you will. The cost approach is highly suited to those, since it is a mathematical model where it is built in with valuation variables and coefficients that address value for in the residential home market, square footage. It applies depreciation equitably across the spectrum. What it is doing is you are using that same valuation model for all homes. So everybody is valued using the same technique with the appropriate adjustments for differences in size, age, grade, quality of construction, whether they have a garage or not. It is treating everybody equitably. Everybody is being done appraised using that same basic technique. The intent, of course, being is that if the model is valuing this home at 95% of what it sold for, then logically that is being extended to all the properties that have not sold, because we are using the same valuation technique. But again, applying the same adjustments for the individual differences in that property, theoretically then everybody would be at 95% of market value. Because ultimately what the assessor is trying to do is, our appraisals are for ad valorem purposes, for property taxes. Ultimately, our values are being used to apportion and distribute the property tax levy. That is the use of assessed values. Who is going to pay what portion of the total property tax levy? That's why we do what we do. So if we are indeed at 95% of market value on all property in Petersburg Borough, then nobody is paying less than what they should, and nobody is paying more than they should. Everybody is receiving an equitable portion of the property tax levy that your Borough Assembly is levying in this community.
So Ron, it sounds easier than it actually is, though, because market value, defining that, since Alaska's a non-disclosure state, people don't have to tell the borough what they sold their house for. And, you know, all of the municipalities in Alaska are having a hard time with that. I believe you told me one time like 6 states out of 50 are non-disclosure states. Is that,
yes.
Is that close?
Alaska is one of the few.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, is the state working on trying to change that with the legislature?
There is some interest. There have been some inquiries. In fact, if you go to the Legislative Research Service, there was actually a request, and only legislators can request services of the LRS. I can show you where to get this report. And that report, I believe, was done in 2014. Now, it is interesting to notice a very good report, fairly extensive report, but I would also point out that whoever the legislator or legislators were who requested this report be provided to them did not want to have their name attached to that report. Okay. The point being on there is interest in that. It is discussed. It would certainly make our jobs far, far easier, especially traditionally what happens is that we get sales information as best we can by asking for it. It's voluntary disclosure. It is not required that it be provided. I always tell people it's kind of interesting that by state statute we are required to appraise property at full, fair, and true market value. However, at the same time, we are denied access to the sales information to define what full, fair, true market value is. And it's an interesting little catch-22. Okay. But I can get that report for you. There is interest in doing so. Which is encouraging. When I first started in this profession back in 1991, I couldn't imagine that happening. So there is some progression going on. You know, what is basically going on is that if indeed, long story short, if everybody's at 100% of market value across the spectrum, then you have this mill rate. Mm-hmm. If everybody is at 50% of market value, okay, which you could easily do at the same rate, well, that just necessitates that you double your mill rate. Okay, you're going to receive exactly the same property tax bill that you would receive if everybody's at 100%. You're just cutting your property tax base in half, so to obtain the same amount of revenue, you've got to double your property tax rate. Mm-hmm. It's not about when the assessor raises the value on a piece of property, the borough does not receive additional revenue. What that acts to do is to decrease the millage rate for all concerned. It's not about increasing revenues at all. What it's about is making sure that we are at equitably appraising all property, which again is decreasing that mill rate and making sure that everybody is at that same rate. That's what disclosure would provide assessors, is an increased level of fairness across the spectrum. Not having access to that sales information significantly handicaps the assessor in making sure that that distribution of the property tax levy makes it extremely difficult.
Thank you.
Role of the board. This is by statute, unless otherwise designated, the Board of Equalization is comprised of the Assembly or the City Council members. However, the Assembly can delegate this authority to a lay board. In other words, local citizens are appointed to act instead of the City Council or Borough Assembly members. Appointed boards may not be less than 3 members. You must have at least 3 members. Now, that lay board can be composed of totally of members of the public. It can be made up of Assembly members or City Council members alone. Or you can combine them, have a mix and match. You know, some of the members might be Assembly or City Council members. Some of them may be members of the public. That is an option. I will tell you, the municipality of Anchorage adopted that philosophy some years back, many years back. Obviously, the Borough Assembly, or I should say municipality of Anchorage Assembly, cannot hear every appeal of property in a, they have 100,000 parcels there. It worked quite well, especially it's much easier to get a board of 3 people together to hear the appeals, much easier to convene a sufficient board, and it has worked quite well. There are several other communities around the state that have adopted that. The functions of the lay board are identical to an Assembly or City Council staff board. Listens to the presentations of the appellant and the assessor, okay, and makes the determinations, their determinations based upon the facts presented at the hearing. I will be reiterating that until you wish not to hear that anymore. Make your decisions based upon the evidence provided by the appellant or the assessor. Do not be bringing in evidence of your own into the hearing. It is the appellant's case. It is the assessor's case. It is not your case. Your job is to review the evidence that is provided to you and base your decision on that. Imagine yourself in the appellant's shoes. How would you feel if you have prepared your case and you are in front of the board and one of the board members introduces evidence that you may or may not have wanted? No. Make your decision based upon what the assessor provides and what the appellant provides. Sometimes it's a little difficult, and there are limitations to how unbiased we can be. We are human beings, but you need to do your best as possible to constrain yourself to that. Okay. Role of the appellant. The appellant is seeking a change in value, therefore they have the burden of proof. They need to prove to you that in the case of their property, the assessor has made a mistake, the value is too high or the value is too low. They need to, when they achieve that burden of proof that is sufficient to convince the board that a change needs to be made. The appellant needs to provide facts, not rumor, anecdotes, okay, preferably in documentary form. Verifiable market-based evidence as to why a change needs to be made in the value of that property. Role of the Assembly Council, okay, again, unless otherwise appointed, the Board of Equalization will be the Assembly or Council. Hopefully, if you do a appointed Board of Equalization, obviously what you would like to have are individuals who are knowledgeable as to elements of real estate, economics, market, business, that type of thing. The Board of Equalization, again, that is the interpreter of the facts presented at the hearing. Only those facts presented at the hearing. The assessor, we've touched on this already. Assessor's goal is to achieve uniform assessments using mass appraisal techniques, not fee appraisal techniques. Okay, by uniform, again, what we're talking about is equity, making sure, and we measure equity as commonly we use what's called the AS ratio. That is the base of measuring our performance. It is simply taking the sales that we have available and that are confirmed arm's length market transactions, and we take our assessed values and we divide them by the sales prices. So if a property sells for $100,000 and we have it assessed at $90,000, we are at an AS ratio of 90%. We were 90% of what the property actually sold for. When you take a look across the spectrum of all sales, well, ideally we would like to be in such a situation is, and this is fairly standard across the state, is most departments are around 95% of market value. Okay. Nobody can appraise a piece of property for what it'll actually sell for. The best any assessor or appraiser, even in the private fee world, can do is get close. We are talking about real estate. It is not a perfect market. Right now, the New York Stock Exchange is closed. However, I can tell you by looking on my smartphone exactly what a share of IBM is selling for right now on the Hang Seng Index. Okay, because it trades 24/7, and a share of IBM is a share of IBM, no matter whether you're in Europe, China, Hong Kong, America, doesn't make a difference. I can get that down to a penny. That's easy. Real estate, every home is different from another home. Every retail shop is different from another one. They're all different. Okay. The best any appraiser can do is get close. And that's all we're trying to do. But we're trying to be uniform with that across the spectrum and treat everybody fairly and equitably. Okay? So again, what the assessor is trying to do, where the fee appraiser is trying to detail a market value on a specific individual property, we use mass appraisal techniques, and we are essentially, not essentially, we are charged with appraising all property in Petersburg Borough every year. It is not practical for us to do a complete fee appraisal of every single piece of property. It would be extremely expensive to do so. That's why we use our mass appraisal techniques. We are trying to achieve market value, but we are also trying to be efficient and equitable with that process at the same time. Okay. On appeal, when that has come up, when that question has come up, that trade-off between market value and equity, in the cases that have been heard on that particular issue, the courts have generally sided with equity. Yes, this value is not market value. It is low. Maybe it's, I'm just going to make, maybe it is 80% of market value. But the assessor is using the same technique with all properties, so theoretically, all other properties are at 80% of market value. Okay. As long as the equity is there, the courts have generally decided to leave it alone, leave the maintain the equity. To change that single property takes it out of equity with everyone else. So again, the courts have tended to leave the property at that lesser rate to maintain the equity within the rest of the community. Role of the assessor. Assessor is appointed by the mayor, manager, or assembly. They are the administrator of property assessments. I understand, obviously here you have a contract assessor. The assessor will determine exemption requests as well, process those. The assessor's job is also to discover all taxable property, both real and personal. Make sure that if there is property within your jurisdiction that is indeed taxable, that it is indeed valued and is on the property tax roll. These days, I was being shown earlier some of the maps that were hanging up in the room adjoining here with your GIS system. Outstanding. GIS, when I first started, didn't exist. Came along about 4 or 5 years later in some of the publications from the larger jurisdictions, and we used to sit around and talk about it and dream, yeah, we will be retired long before we get a GIS system. Not so. 3 or 4 years later, we had one. It went from a dream to an absolute requirement extremely fast. It's no longer an option. It's no longer a luxury. It is a requirement for any assessor if they're going to do a decent job. The assessor also administers personal property assessments. If they are indeed done in the local community, state of Alaska, via the statutes, you have the opportunity to exempt all personal property, parts of personal property. It is a local call. Assessor will also list all property. And when we talk about list all property, it's actually a term that's common on the East Coast. When we're talking about listing property, is within your assessment system, it is a description of the property. This home was built in the year 2000. It's 1,500 square feet. It has an attached garage. It is simply the description of the property in text or numerals that the assessor uses to establish the valuation. So that's what listing means. We here in Alaska, where we will call it amongst ourselves, is the inventory, the property inventory. Obviously, then the assessor will value all taxable real and personal property. They will then issue the notice, the assessment notice that everybody is so happy to receive every year, and issue that out to the property owner. And of course, that begins the 30-day appeals process. And then the assessor, if required, will appear before the Board of Equalization to defend their valuations. Again, property owners may appeal to the BOE for relief from inaccurate assessments. The appeal is to the board, not to the assessor. Okay, the appellant, again, bears the burden of proof. If the appellant meets that burden, then the burden reverts back to the assessor. and we'll touch on this in a little bit, is this point counterpoint trade-off in the hearing process. The appeal should be in a written format with evidence why the owner feels the assessment is unjust. Obviously, documentary evidence carries somewhat more weight, at least in my mind, than verbal. It's documented, it's verifiable. It carries a lot more weight in my mind than just verbal testimony. It is not sufficient for the appellant merely to establish that there is a disagreement with the assessor's value. My assessment is too high. Okay, based on what? Give me some evidence to substantiate that assertion that the assessment is too high.
I have a couple questions.
Certainly.
When you do your assessments, it's all based on just looking at a building from the outside, right? For the most
Usually, yes. Obviously, assessors are not on the top 10 hit parade of the public's favorite public employees. Okay. Never understood that, but that's just the way it is. I've lived with it for 26 years.
So they don't invite you in.
Excuse me?
So they don't invite you into their house.
No, not typically. When we come up to a property, we'll knock on the door. Hi, my name's Ron. I'm from the Borough Assessment Department. I'm here to provide a periodic inspection of the property. Most places will go around every catch can I just got out of is once every 4 years. We physically inspect the property. That's an exterior inspection. If there are conditions interior to the home that the property owner mentions, well, then it's rather incumbent that there be an interior inspection. My roof leaks. My basement, which you have is finished, is in fact unfinished. Well, for me to consider that, I'm going to have to examine it. In 26 years, I know it's a shocker, but I've had a couple people who have actually told me that their basement is unfinished when actually it was finished. There have been a few cases where substantial facts have actually been misrepresented to me. I know that's a shocker. But what in that capacity, I always viewed it as keeping things honest and upfront and acting as the eyes and ears of the Board of Equalization. Yes, I did go in the house. I saw the staining on the ceiling. The roof is in fact leaking.
So when you assess it, like say you have two people that have relatively similar size homes, similar size property, right next to each other, same location. I mean, I'm assuming that they'd have the same values if you have not been inside them, but what if one's completely custom and one's, well, not so much?
I understand. And there are limitations on that, but you can only, quite frankly, take that so far, okay? The home, the exterior and the appearance of the home in most homes is going to be, in other words, grade is continued on into the interior of the house, okay? Otherwise, you get into the one of the appraisers I used to work with used to talk about is, well, what is the value of solid gold plumbing fixtures in a single-wide mobile home? Okay. It gets to be completely out of place. It's what we would call functionally inadequate.
So you basically look at what the structure of the house, like if they have, nice siding, everything that's top of the line, that probably you assume that it's probably rolls into
the house. There are basic grades in there. It's going to carry on into the interior of the home, okay? That quality of construction that is evident from the outside, or also too, that lack of quality of construction to the inside is going to carry on into the inside of the home. And not even as a general rule, almost invariably that is the case.
Darn it, I should not paint my house.
Okay. That's another issue in there that I'm glad you mentioned that gets, we do not consider that. You've just painted your home, okay? Painting your home is standard maintenance, especially in an environment as windy and as wet as Southeast Alaska. Re-roofing your home, we anticipate that
The maintenance as well.
yeah, that's normal, standard, average maintenance. That's not going to have the only time that that's going to really be relevant to the value is when you do not provide that average maintenance to maintain your home. And then obviously you've got water in the walls, water in the insulation, and the house is now falling apart.
Right. Okay.
But just because you have put a fresh coat of paint on your house, no, we're not going to adjust the value upwards for that. We're talking more about design.
About siding or nothing like that, just basically like if you notice, like they do a remodel or something along those lines, that would be something
that would be indicative on there, and again, that's average maintenance to a certain degree. It's built into the depreciation. I was raised in a house with the avocado green shag carpeting, okay, and the copper refrigerator and stovetop. When we sold the home, guess what? Shag carpet came out, and they have copper tone appliances, they came out, and that was replaced. There's a periodic maintenance that goes on with homes, and it's just it's kind of built into the real estate market itself. But again, we are taking a look at the market as a whole. Our objective is not to get down to brass tacks and get precise with each individual property. We are mass appraisers. We are not fee appraisers. Okay. We're just trying to get close and be fair and equitable with all properties.
I guess I was just trying to understand how, if you're just looking at the outside, how you can base what you're basing it on as the quality of, but that makes sense. Thank you.
Well, one of the, and I'm not certain, do you have a Marshall and Swift residential handbook handy here?
I might in Arnie's box.
Well, we can certainly get, if not, when they come down here, we can, what I'm getting to is in Marshall and Swift, which again is the, essentially the appraiser's Bible, not the assessor's Bible. It is the appraiser's Bible. We use it too as assessors. Assessors and appraisers use this. And they have a nice breakdown in there of different grades of homes, okay, from low to fair, average, good, very good, excellent. And there is a progression that you can basically see is basically a low fair grade home is a square rectangle, no breaks, okay. As you go up the grading scale, that's when you start getting the bay windows, the jags, the cuts, the custom construction techniques, okay. And that's indicative of the quality and the cost of the construction of that particular property. And that holds true throughout the residential market. I would, there are very few properties, I would have to strain my memory to see, find an example where the exterior design and construction of the property was extremely high quality, yet it was the interior fixtures came out of the Sears Craftsman category.
Right.
You just don't do that. You do not take a Ferrari and put a Volkswagen Bug engine in it. It's just not done. It's not a prudent investment at all. it is rather consistent. Now, there are aberrations, yes. Okay. But again, and that's where, the disclosure issue does become part of it. I think the best example I could give you is I do know of one home in the Anchorage area where a gentleman, for whatever reason, built a very nice, very high quality home in an extremely poor quality neighborhood. Sticks out like a bump on a log. Extremely poor choice. The gentleman will never be able to sell that home for what it's worth because what it would be worth elsewhere, I should say. Because building such a structure, location. Okay. That home would command a far higher value were it built in a different location. The buyer for that home is, yes, it's a beautiful home, but I do not want to live in this neighborhood. Does that help?
Yeah, that helps.
Okay. You said you had a couple questions.
Oh, I don't know what, I lost the other one. I'll write it down, I'll get back to you.
It is a good question. It is a good question. And that's just part and parcel, and it's not unique to Alaska. But assessors aren't popular in Alaska, and they're not a popular person elsewhere either. Okay, it continues into the lower 48 as well.
So, Ron, and I think this is a hang-up for a lot of people, for me especially. If I were to sell my house for, let's say, $300,000, and I told the assessor what I sold it for, he wouldn't necessarily then just go and revalue my house at $3,000 for the assessment. He would use it in his overall ratio of the market, correct?
Excellent point, excellent question. If you sold your house for $300,000 and your assessor changed your value to $300,000, that is a practice that we call sales chasing. And we would be all over him like stink on a skunk.
That's what I thought.
That is terrible practice. It is it's not fair to you, it's not fair to the rest of the taxpayers. Okay. What the assessor in good practice should do is take that sales information and the property inventory, the description of your property. That then becomes one of the comparable sales, just like in a fee appraisal, that is used to establish the model valuation for the upcoming year.
Right.
So, yes, it would be highly unusual that the valuation, the subsequent year's valuation of your property would be $300,000. It would hopefully be closer to $300,000. But if the valuation was exactly $300,000, there's a small chance that might happen, but it would be suspicious, shall we say.
Yeah.
But as using that as a comparable, so far as if our valuations were here and this is your $300,000 sales price, what it would be used for is to take the entire sequence, not only your home or your ex-home, you just sold it, but all homes within the area and bring them all up. Or if you sold it for less than assessed value because the market is going down, which given the current fiscal environment is not out of the question, to take that value and, values are dropping, take the model down.
Great. Thank you.
Rules should be, the rules should be set down in writing and known to all prior to the hearing. Known to the board, known to the appellant, known to the assessor. Again, this is a quasi-judicial hearing. The hearing is on the record. It is based on law. It is based on statutes. It is based on your borough code. Your decision should be based on the evidence and argument presented at the hearing. And remember, you are subject to judicial review by a higher court if so needed. Due process, obviously, the property owner and the assessor are participants in this. Due process must be provided. Prior notice and hearing. Okay, there must be a hearing if so requested by the again by the appellant, and they must have sufficient notice. The hearing must be on the record. The appellant and the assessor have right to counsel. It does happen, and they have a right to it. The duty of the board are to be unbiased, impartial decision makers and to base their decisions solely upon the evidence that is provided at the hearing. And as a final result of the hearing, to provide findings and conclusions of law. We're going to touch on that in just a second. Evidence and argument. Both parties, and this is the typical sequence. Again, this should be specified as a process. Both parties have an opportunity to present their evidence and argument. Typically, the most common procedure is that the appellant will present their case, then the assessor will present their case. Then the appellant has an opportunity to rebut the evidence, the case of the assessor. And then the assessor has an opportunity to rebut the appellant's rebuttal. Okay, so they each have two opportunities to speak. Okay. Then typically the Board of Equalization will make a motion to close testimony, shutting down both the appellant and the assessor after that. Now, after that procedure, well, throughout the testimony of the appellant and the assessor, and after they have finished their cases, you as the Board of Equalization have the opportunity to ask pointed, direct questions of the appellant or the assessor to your heart's desire. You may ask as many questions as you wish. If you have a concern about evidence or wish to explore some avenue, you may quiz them directly. I would also point out too is, and just to make sure that there is proper decorum, the appellant or the assessor may ask questions of the opposing party in their rebuttal. I would suggest that such questions be directed to the chairman of the Board of Equalization, and then let the chairman of the board direct them to the appellant. In other words, if I want to ask a question of the appellant in my rebuttal, I direct it to the chairman and have the chairman ask the appellant. Some of these, it just provides better decorum, especially if we do have a situation where the hearing is getting, shall we say, heated. And yes, that does happen. Okay. Findings of fact and conclusions of law. Extremely important, especially in case your decision gets appealed to Superior Court. Findings of fact is simply a statement of the significant issues of that particular case that you, as the board members, found to be persuasive. What swayed your opinion? What was it about either the assessor's case or the appellant's case, or both, that swayed and brought you to the decision that you made? What did you find convincing that rendered your decision? Conclusion of law is essentially your decision itself. We did not feel that the appellant met their burden of proof based upon the lack of this information or the information provided by the assessor. Therefore, we opted to sustain the assessor's valuation. Or vice versa, because of this evidence mentioned by, provided by the appellant and documented here and here and here, we felt that was sufficient to convince us that a mistake had been made in the valuation of the property. Okay. But the findings of fact are the evidence that convinced you to make your decision as documented in your conclusion of law. That is the first thing that the Superior Court will look at, is here is the decision. When I look at the findings of fact, is that sufficient evidence to me to sustain or understand the decision that this board made? If it is not sufficient, it is highly likely it will be remanded back to you for another hearing. And none of us wants that. Treat every case as if it will be appealed to the courts. Again, the court will review the record of the hearing. There will be no rehearing of the appeal in the Superior Court. Superior Court will generate its decision on the record that is generated here. Okay, they need to know how you made your decision. Okay, so kind of have to, in doing your findings of fact and conclusions of law, if you can take a look at those findings of fact and conclusion of law, and it makes sense to you that okay, this supports someone can read this and understand the decision we made and why we made it, then the Superior Court judge should be able to understand that as well. And then, more than likely, your decision will be sustained. Legal authority, correct application of law. Again, it's a substantial evidence test. Again, this goes right back to your findings, fact, and conclusion of law. They're going to review the record and the evidence that you have cited in your findings of fact to make sure that it is relevant and supportive of your decision. Okay. Without that, okay, then you are subject to, there's a test of abuse of discretion by the board, and those two words that we hear so much, arbitrary and capricious. Essentially meaning that the outcome of the decision was without foundation. There was not sufficient evidence to support the decision or the outcome of that, or that in subsequent hearings on much the same issue, different decisions came out of the Board of Equalization given the same evidence. You must make sure that that your decisions are consistent. That essentially, if you are make a decision based on this evidence for this property, then if there's another property that follows up that has the same situation with the same issues and the same evidence, the same decision, or basically the same decision, should be generated by the board. Make sure it's consistent. Late filed appeals. The board may allow a late filing if the owner was unable to comply within the 30-day appeal period. You should have in place a written criteria of what constitutes sufficient reason for filing a late appeal. Okay, what are the criteria? Is being in the hospital in a coma sufficient reason for granting a late file?
Depends on if I like them or not.
That would be called arbitrary and capricious.
Honestly, we don't usually ever, I don't remember ever taking a late appeal. Mm-hmm. Ever.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's in our code.
It's not in our code, though. We don't have it written down.
But there is allowance in the statutes for filing, okay, again, with sufficient evidence, okay? So I would certainly hope that if I was in the hospital in a coma and I had documentary evidence that, yes, I was temporarily comatose, that consideration would be applied. Now, if I did not get my appeal filed because I was on vacation in Aruba, I would, my outtake on that might be a little bit different. Okay. One's a little more compelling than the other is my point. Okay. But again, be consistent with your approvals and denials. And note that the assessor's office, by law, is required to mail the notice to the last known address of the or owner. So again, that is a requirement of the assessor's office. If your mailing address has changed, it is incumbent upon the property owner to notify the assessor that they wish their assessment notice to be mailed. The assessor has only that information that is provided by the property owner. If the property has sold after the original assessment notice was issued, I would point out that all assessments for real property are public record. A simple telephone call to the borough will get you the real property valuation of any parcel of any person in this borough. And I do not know, is your tax roll digitized and on the web?
Yes.
Yeah.
It is. So you do not even have to give a phone call. You can look it up on your smartphone even.
It's even on the map. The assessment values are on the map.
Yeah, yes.
Okay. Alaska statutes 2945-110 through 2945-210 will provide you the legal authority for the Board of Equalization to hear appeals of value. Assessments are guided by the statute, by your borough code, okay, which of course your borough code must follow state statute, and by court cases. The statutes cannot follow and allow for every particular individual property situation that arises. So the court cases in the state of Alaska, which are essentially composed of appeals of BOE decisions, are there to help support for those special cases. Some reasons given for tax reduction. Taxes are too high, value increase too much. Oh my gosh, I've heard these for 26 years. No improvements made to the property. Neighbor's house is valued less. Not enough services from municipality for taxes paid. Again, I have heard these multiple times. I will just pick one example. Neighbor's house is valued less than mine. Well, your neighbor's house is half the size. There's a good reason for it. Maybe. Now, in our townhouse example, if I own the $250,000, the $250,000 townhouse, and my neighbors on both sides are at $200,000, that's a good point. Good question. So again, the assertion must be backed with sufficient evidence as to why that is inequitable, why that is unreasonable. Okay. Some BOE don'ts. Do not offer a small deduction to help out the appellant. Again, we're trying to establish equity in the property tax burden. Although those small deductions, again, we're trying to be equitable. Anytime there is an adjustment that is not warranted by the evidence as to the value of the property, that property is being taken out of equity with everything else. And in such a case, it is important to understand that the taxes that are being relieved do not go away. Those taxes are just simply being exported to the rest of the community. Do not bring your own comparables. Consider only what's presented at the hearing. Again, remember, your assessor is going to provide you a mass appraisal, not a complete fee appraisal that we're used to seeing. Do not try to review a case where the question is a matter of law, not value. By statute, the board is here to determine the value of the property. This is a recurring issue here in Alaska. Specifically here, what we're talking about is matters of taxability, in other words, exemptions. Exemptions, in the opinion of the state assessor's office, are not an issue for the Board of Equalization. The Board of Equalization is here to decide what the value of the property is. It is the assessor's job, with their expertise and experience and training in Title 29 and the relevant court cases, to decide whether a property meets the criteria for an exemption. And I believe it is in the statutes at 2945, 200, it's 200 or 220, it is stated in there that appeals of decisions of the assessor as to taxability are appealable to Superior Court. And it is the contention of the state assessor's office that such appeals as to matters of exemption, again, are not appropriate at the Board of Equalization, but should indeed go to Superior Court. So that's what we're talking about there. Do not attempt to reappraise the property unless the burden of proof has been met by the appellant. If the appellant meets the burden of proof and convinces you based on the evidence, the preponderance of the evidence is in their favor, then yes, it is rather incumbent that the Board of Equalization substitute a new value. That's your job. Remember, all assessments are made as of January 1st. Post-assessment date tragedies cannot be changed by the Board of Equalization. The date of valuation in Alaska is January 1st. It is the property as of that date. If on January 1st a house or a store or a retail structure is there, and on February 1st it burns down, it's there. It was there on January 1st. It is taxable for the full year. However, I know that seems rather unfair and unreasonable. I would also point out to you that it works the other way as well. If that lot is vacant on January 1st and I build a house on it on February 2nd, I only pay taxes on the vacant lot for that year. That new house will not be picked up until the subsequent year. And in the case where it burned down in the next year, if it is still a vacant lot, well, then the house will then be removed by the assessor because it is no longer there. January 1st is the effective date. There is a clause in the statute for disasters. Have you adopted that in your code here?
The fire and the, yeah.
Okay.
They have a certain time period to.
They have a certain time period. Again, there is a separate process for that, okay, which also, of course, if necessary, involves the Board of Equalization. But in this round of the original valuation, January 1st is the effective date. BOE dues do show both the appellant and the assessment staff the courtesy of your attention. Do make your decisions based only on the facts. That will reduce, ensure that you don't have to hear the evaluations or cases twice. Leave your appraisal calculator at the front door and leave your comps, your own personal knowledge, as best you can at the front door. I know it's difficult. We are humans. Okay. And the other thing I would point out too is that I've been doing this for 26 years. I'm used to testifying to boards of equalization. And as members of the board, you're used to being in a public forum. Typically, your appellant is not. I say typically. A lot of them are people who are, shall we say, fighting City Hall for the first time. They're a fish out of the water. A lot of them are not conversant in matters of appraisal or real estate. I have, in many instances, seen the board bend over backwards to even at sometimes assist the appellant in stating their case sufficiently. In such cases, again, we want to make sure they get a proper, fair hearing based on the evidence. They are nervous. They are not conversant. I have never objected to that in such a situation, especially people who are just homeowners who are now we're at the case of a professional appraiser. Okay, different story, but. Do be aware that that appellant quite frequently is going to have problems stating their case. I find that only fair, reasonable, and it ensures that everybody gets a good, proper hearing. And were it to be appealed, I think the reflection of such an effort by the Superior Court judge would only be positive. And, okay, just summary, you're going to review the assessments prepared by the assessor. Make sure your determination is based on the evidence provided to you. And be sure that when that case is resolved, that your statement of your findings of fact and conclusions of law are sufficient for somebody else to read and understand what you did and why you did it. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Questions for Ron before we go? You'll be here. Are you coming in tomorrow?
I'll be in tomorrow morning, yes. Okay. At least in the early morning. I think my flight leaves at 11. I'm going to go ahead and review that. We can get you that, Marshall, and so you can peruse that. If not, your assessor will be able to basically show you what I was talking about there. You can kind of easily understand what we're talking about there, and then go through your appeal form.
Okay,
I do have a quick question, just